Good morning, everyone. It's 9 o'clock, so we will make a start. A very warm welcome to our event to commemorate the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Welcome to schools in the UK, schools in France, and at least one from Tunis, and there may well be schools from other places. So please introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us where your school is and how many pupils are there with you. I'm going to pass over to our three guests to very briefly introduce themselves. Jane, can I go to you first?
Yes, my name is Jane Furlong, and I'm the lead historical researcher for the British Normandy Memorial. And we have the memorial that was built in Vers-sur-Mer in France to commemorate all those who were serving under British command, who were killed on D-Day and in the Battle of Normandy.
Thank you. David, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Morning, Vicky. Morning, everybody. My name's David Abritat. I'm the departmental historian for an organisation called GCHQ, which is one of the three intelligence agencies in Britain.
Brilliant, thank you. And Claire, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, I'm Claire Andrieux, and I'm a history professor at Sciences Po in Paris.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. So the way this event is going to work, first of all, the three speakers will give us a bit of background and a bit of information about what happened on D-Day. And then there'll be a chance to answer your questions. So while people are speaking, think if you have questions you would like to add and ask your teacher to add them to the chat. Okay, so let's get started. So the first question I'm going to ask to Jane is, can you tell us what was happening in the war by 1944? Why did the Allies decide to move into northern France?
Well, that's a big question, to say the least. I thought I'd actually start by looking briefly why we needed to go into France in the first place. After Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor in Germany in 1933, the threat of conflict began to increase. Germany, like many others, was in the midst of an economic crisis due to the Great Depression, which had made millions unemployed. But in Germany, many had linked this to what they saw as the humiliating Treaty of Versailles. The Nazis used this as fertile ground to wave their rise to power with their promise to pull the country out of depression, reverse the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, and unite all German-speaking peoples and achieve what they termed Lebensraum, i.e. more living space for the German people. The British government attempted to appease the German government to preserve peace, but their attempts failed, unfortunately. And in 1939, after Germany had invaded and conquered Czechoslovakia, as part of its move towards Lebensraum, Britain had made a guarantee that if Poland was invaded, Britain would go to war to protect them. Now, when Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Britain and France said they would declare war if they did not leave. Unsurprisingly, Germany didn't, and on the 3rd of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. By 1940, Germany occupied most of Europe, and in 1941, they invaded the Soviet Union. America joined the fight in December 1941 after Japan bombed the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The global conflict was to last 6 years, but the principal allied nations of Britain, America, and the Soviet Union agreed that they would first work to defeat Germany before turning their attention to Japan. So, in the spring of 1943, the Anglo-American allies agreed to carry out an attack across the English Channel into France. But they realised it couldn't happen until 1944 due to commitments on other operations and the fact that the preparations would take time, as it was a huge planning and logistical effort. The Allies first had to identify a suitable landing site in France, though. It needed to be within range of southern England and have beaches suitable for prolonged support operations and adequate exits. The Normandy coast between Caen and Cherbourg was chosen for this. And the Allies then developed plans to land troops and supplies in France, from which further offensive operations could be developed. The American General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander in December 1943. Allied troops and logistics were then planned for the greatest naval, air and ground assault ever undertaken. The Germans expected an Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe would be launched, but they didn't know when or where it would be. So from 1942, they began to build large coastal defences and fortifications, known as the Atlantic Wall, which stretched along the whole of the French coast and as far up as Scandinavia. In the meantime, the Allies began to prepare their invasion force. An initial plan was devised, but when General Bernard Montgomery was appointed commander of the ground forces, who would land on the beaches, he and General Eisenhower felt more troops would be needed, so he increased the areas that they would land on. Now, the code name for the operation was Operation Overlord, and the seaborne assault to take the troops and supplies to the French coast was codenamed Operation Neptune. Admiral Sir Bertrand Ramsay was responsible for this element, and Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory was responsible for the air support. As the plans progressed, most of the United Kingdom became one large military camp. Troops were based around the UK, and as they trained ahead of the landings, near the invasion, as the invasion came closer, they gradually moved closer to the south coast, ready for embarkation. There was also a huge effort to build up the supplies needed for the invasion, and landing craft were built in the UK and in America to help take those supplies and the troops to France. The planners also knew a port would be vital, but it was unlikely they could capture one quickly, as they would be heavily defended. So they decided to bring their own harbour over, which became known as the Mulberry Harbour. More than 55,000 men were involved in its construction, which began in 1943. Deception would also be a vital part of the plans to ensure the best success for the landings. So the Allies developed plans to try and fool the Germans into believing that they intended to land in the Pas de Calais area, and that is where they should concentrate their troops, as any other landing point would just be a feint. In this, thank goodness, they succeeded. It was a united international effort with more than 2 million troops from over 30 countries preparing for the invasion. They primarily came from the US, UK and Canada, but they also came from Australia and New Zealand, India and the Caribbean, and the occupied countries of France, Belgium, Poland and the former Czechoslovakia and Norway, and many others, reflecting the fact that it was a global conflict. And hopefully I've answered that question in enough detail.
That's brilliant. That was a very big question to answer, and that's brilliant. That gives us an idea about the lead up to D-Day. Getting us to the point of D-Day. Claire, I'd like to ask you, so at this point, France was occupied by the Germans. Can you tell us what life was like in Normandy and in France under German occupation?
Yes, life was tough. I will use an expression given by a former resistor after the war. He said life under the occupation was cold, hunger and fear. And cold and hunger because the Germans were exploiting the French economy. They were pillaging the crops, livestock and industrial products. They also were taking they also took the coal and the wood. So life was in general tough. And what was fear about? It was about repression by the Germans. And first of all, it was a fear by those who were not only resistors, but also simple inhabitants who didn't cope with the new German rules. For instance, as soon as 1940, some teenagers were shot by the Wehrmacht because they had cut the telecommunication cables of the Wehrmacht. Also because they had tried to reach England by boat, and if the German Kriegsmarine arrested them during their trip, the leaders of these small groups would be shot and the others sent to Germany. So fear was general. At the end of the war, almost 90,000 resistors had been deported to Germany, to concentration camps. 76,000 Jewish families had been deported to extermination camps. 600,000 youngsters aged 21, 22 had been forcibly sent to work in Germany, whereas about 2,000 had tried to escape this compulsory labor service, and so on. So life was tough, and I would like to show you this underground newspaper called Liberation, where you see the announcement for this compulsory labor service. And it is, the title of the first page is French Youth Answers. And this is the answer of the youth to this compulsory service, meant to help the German armament, the German industry of armament. On the bottom of the page, you see the shooting of a 17-year-old boy who had cut telecommunication cables. The other aspect of this life under occupation is the rise of the resistance. So I gave you some examples of the first resistance. Another one could be given with the help given the Allies by the French population during the war. As soon as 1940, inhabitants helped the British soldiers who had been stuck in France after Dunkirk. They helped them hide and reach Britain through the south of France, then Spain, then Gibraltar, then England. And after the soldiers, then came the aviators who fell over France, and there were probably some 10,000 of them, and 4,000 of them managed to escape continental Europe, partly thanks to French inhabitants. Those helpers were about 34,000, and about a quarter of them were deported to concentration camps. This is the first spontaneous resistance. And then since 1943, the small groups united among themselves, and then the external resistance incarnated by General de Gaulle organized the general unification of the resistance. So one may say that since May 1943, when the National Council of the Resistance was founded in underground, in the clandestinity, there existed one only resistance, united among themselves in France and with de Gaulle's resistance. So then started the renewal of democratic France.
Thank you. That gives us a really good, interesting background as to what was happening in France. And it's really interesting to hear what was happening to young people, that there were people as young as 17 involved and younger involved in the resistance, who some of them died because of their involvement. I'm going to go to David now and ask you about what was secret intelligence telling us about German plans, and how were we trying to redirect the Germans?
Thank you, Vicky. So yeah, just emphasising a warm welcome to everybody joining us today. I'm just going to talk through what intelligence, Allied intelligence, provided some insights into the German defences. It's a very big story. But intelligence is really important to understand the defensive positions, the German defenders, what their morale was, what weapons they were using. And that's not just in Normandy, but for all theatres of war around the world. So in places like North Africa, in Burma, because the better prepared an invasion force is, the less lives will be lost on the front line. and I'm very passionate about D-Day because one of my first books that I've written in my life was about D-Day. So I'm very engaged in this topic. So Jane mentioned there was 5 invasion beaches, and all those beaches, we needed to understand what those beaches were like and the defensive positions around those. So there's a variety of methods that Allied intelligence would gather this sort of information. I'm going to talk just briefly about some of those stories. So on the right-hand side, you've got a postcard. Now that's a postcard of a village in Normandy called Aramonche. And during the build-up to D-Day, there was a photographic library constructed in the basement of the Bodleian Library in Oxford University. And the BBC put out a radio broadcast in 1942, 1943 and 1944 to ask the members of the public in Britain for their holiday photographs. So photographs when they'd gone to places all over the world, but including to Normandy. And those postcards and those photographs were sent to this library in the basement of the Bodleian Library. And teams of staff would look at these photographs to understand a bit more about the beaches and the villages and the defences around those, because even a photograph like that can tell you a lot when the landing crafts are coming ashore, how those beaches could be attacked by the Allies. The chap on the left, he's a French resistance fighter. Now, French resistance was really important to gather intelligence. It's often the case that people with local knowledge can provide that level of intelligence. And the chap is called René Duché, and he was a painter and decorator in a town called Caen in Normandy. And he worked, as well as being a painter and decorator, he was a member of the French resistance in a network called the Réseau Century, or the Century Network. And he was offered a job in an office called for an organization called a TOD organization. Now, they were an engineering firm that were building a lot of these defensive fortifications on the coast of Normandy. And when he went to do the work in this office, to do the painting, he saw on a desk a load of top secret blueprints that were 10 foot long, so but nearly 3 meters long, which had real details about some of the fortifications on the Normandy coastline. And he saw an opportunity when the office was empty, and he rolled up one of those blueprints and stuck it behind the mirror. And he went back the next day, and no one had noticed that blueprint had gone missing. And he stole it and took it back to his resistance team, and it made its way to Paris. And it would be one of the biggest intelligence coups of the entire Second World War, because this laid out the entire plan of the fortifications for Normandy in the build-up to D-Day. Now, my organisation, GCHQ, is headquartered in Cheltenham. We used to be called the Government Code and Cipher School, and we were based in a place called Bletchley Park, which you can see in front of you. And I'm sure many of you have heard of Bletchley Park and the work of code breakers like Alan Turing and Gordon Welshman and Brigadier John Tiltman. You may have seen some of the Hollywood films like The Imitation Game. It was a really, really important hub for British intelligence. The code breaking that went on here would change the outcome of the Second World War. There's been some historians have said it shortened the war by 2 years. But the work that went on here in the build-up to D-Day was really important. And one of the stories is here. So there was a reporting hub within Bletchley called Hut 3, and they were producing reports, very short, succinct reports that would go out very, very quickly. And these were as a result of British interception sites on the south coast of England intercepting the German defenders who were broadcasting information up to their commanders across occupied France. So the Allies wanted a complete communications blackout for the invasion force that was coming across the Channel. So often Allied intelligence knew how we were doing by the interception of German communications. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a date timestamp. It says 02:45 Zulu, 6:44, so at 2:45 in the morning on the 6th of June 1944. You've got a report of Allied parachute landing in Normandy. One of the first offensive actions of Operation Overlord was a parachute landing and to take areas of ground beyond the beaches. So this is an interception of a German defender reporting this up his food chain. So that whole process could take just a few minutes. So it's a very, very important information that was being processed. Now, you've all heard of the German Enigma. There was also a different German cipher machine at play. So when Jane mentioned the Germans had swept across Europe in 1914 and occupied France, there was a command headquarters built by the most senior German generals in the German military. And they built a teleprinter network to relay big strategic messages between these command headquarters. And the Bletchley analysts used to call it the fish network, and each of the links was given the name of a fish. And you could probably just see the detail on that map on the right-hand side. And they needed to make those communications secure. So they brought in a new cipher machine, which is the one on the left, and you've probably never heard of it. It's called the Lorentz cipher machine. And it worked in a very different way from the German Enigma machine, but it was a lot more complicated to break. And the German is the Schlüsselzusatz is the name for the machine. And this cipher was broken by hand by two of our best ever code breakers, Bill Tutt and Brigadier John Tiltman. It was broken in 10 days by hand using a pencil and a piece of paper. It was astonishing. And the strategic messages that were broken out would give huge strategic advantage for Allied intelligence, because it gave us insight into the German commanders in Normandy and even the insights of Adolf Hitler himself. There's also another story. So we needed to know what the defences were like on the beaches. And the chap on the right would give us some of that insight. He's an ambassador in Berlin, a Japanese ambassador. He's called General Hiroshi Oshima. And they were using a different cipher machine. It was called the pupils cipher machine. And British code breakers and American code breakers worked on this problem together. And what they produced would be groundbreaking. He was relaying information back to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tokyo with very long strategic messages. And he was a big friend of Adolf Hitler and some of the German generals. And he was invited in November 1943 to go to the beaches and to see the defences. And after that visit, he broadcast a very long message, which is about 16 pages long, back to Tokyo about all the defences in real detail. That was intercepted. It was broken, decrypted, and it gave us real insight into the detail of some of those defences on the beaches themselves. So it was a huge intelligence coup. And there was an organisation set up during the war called the Theatre Intelligence Section, or TIS. And this was one of their products. And this would produce information about the actual defences in Normandy on the beaches. And this would be produced and reported to the people that needed to know. So the guys that were going ashore on the 6th of June would be as informed as they could be about the actual defences that they were going to come across. So they were very, very well prepared. There's also another interesting story. So on the 6th of June, the Allies put in place a number of ships just offshore from the beach. And on board these ships were hundreds of personnel who would literally sit there listening to German Luftwaffe radio communications of the German Air Force, because they were sending up aircraft to try and attack the Allied ships and Allied aircraft. So these were giving what we call indicators and warnings to the British Air Force and the American Air Force, who would send planes up to intercept the German planes before they got to Normandy. So these ships were really important. They were called Fighter Direction Tenders, FDTs. And they were in place for 17 days after D-Day, and they would have saved countless lives by being in position. And there's some photographs, very, very rare photographs of the operators actually on board those ships. And Jane mentioned there was a huge deception operation. It was called Fortitude, and it involved thousands of staff, and there were various strands to this deception plan. One of those was what we call mobile wireless deception. So you can probably just see in the woods there's a mobile unit which was based just outside Dover. And they were broadcasting false radio traffic, which the Germans were intercepting. And they were basically trying to create a huge Allied army in Eastern England, because we were trying to give the impression that we were coming to the Calais region rather than Normandy. And a part of that deception plan was through a wireless transmission deception plan. And this was one of those units that was deployed. It's a fascinating story in its own right. So I'm going to stop talking there. But the importance of intelligence is to give an understanding of what those defences were, and also to give the best preparation possible for that invasion force. So I'll just hand back to Vicky. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you very much, David. So now I'm going to ask Jane to tell us what actually happened on D-Day. You're on mute, Jane.
There we go. Sorry about that. D-Day was originally set for the 5th of June. Probably many people will be aware of that, but due to the bad weather, it had been postponed, and it finally happened on the 6th of June. Now, some people have asked, what does the term D-Day actually mean? You know, is there any meaning behind those words? And whilst we mainly associate it with the 6th of June 1944, it can actually apply to any start date for an operation. When a military operation is being planned, its actual date and time is not always known. So the term D-Day was used to mean the date on which the operations would begin, whatever that date was. Technically, it means D-Day, but that was shortened to D-Day. The day before D-Day is known as D-1, and the day after D-Day is known as D+1, and so on. It meant that if the date changed, all other dates in the plans didn't have to be corrected, which would have been a bureaucratic and logistical nightmare if you were having to do that. Now, the assault force itself is made up of naval, airborne and ground troops, and divided into eastern and western sections. The American Western Force landed on 2 beaches, codenamed Utah and Omaha, and the British and Canadian Eastern Task Force landed on 3 beaches, codenamed Gold, Judo and Sword. British and American airborne forces would also drop behind the German lines, as David has mentioned, to the west and east of the landing area. The Allies landed around 156,000 troops on the beaches of Normandy between the Seine-Marie-du-Mont and Ouistreham on D-Day. They comprised 73,000 American troops and just over 83,000 British, Canadian and French who landed on the beaches or behind the German lines. They also included civilian news reporters and photographers who were there to report on the landings and how they were going. Now, to enable them to land on the beaches, the naval assault, codenamed Operation Neptune, involved almost 7,000 vessels. They included combat ships, landing ships and landing craft, ancillary craft like the one that David mentioned for the comms ships, minesweepers and also merchant vessels. Almost 11,500 aircraft were also involved in supporting the landings on D-Day, and many others carried out sorties both before and during the campaign to target roads and railways and German strong points and defences to reduce the Germans' ability to get reinforcements to the landing beaches and launch counterattacks. Now, they flew just over 14,000 sorties on D-Day, and 127 aircraft were lost. The airborne landings on both flanks of the beaches involved 2,395 aircraft and 867 gliders of the RAF and USAAF. So it was huge in terms of the resources that were being used. Now, I can imagine that those who were actually landing on D-Day, there would be all sorts of emotions that were going through their minds. I'd say the principal ones would have been determination, fear, seasickness, as going over on the smaller boats in rough seas is not a good way to travel if you don't have any sea legs, and especially for some men who'd actually never been to sea before. So it's a complete novelty for them. But by the end of the day, they'd managed to establish a foothold on the coast of France, one which would not be pushed back into the sea as the Germans had hoped they would do. In terms of casualties, there are about 4,415 men who were killed, including 1,475 men who were serving under British command who were killed on D-Day. There are about just over 2,500 from America. Many more had been wounded, and on the German side, there is an estimated 4,000 to 9,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Now, of course, women weren't meant to be landing on D-Day. You did have the women in France as part of SOE, which was the secret organisation formed to carry out spying and sabotage. And there are those who are part of the French resistance who have been alluded to. But they were working behind the lines. The first women to land in Normandy were American nurses who landed on D+4. However, the D-Day planners hadn't accounted for a very determined woman who wanted to be there from the beginning. Martha Gellhorn was an American journalist and was the only woman to land on D-Day. She managed to get herself on board a hospital ship on the pretense of interviewing the nurses on board, and then locked herself in a toilet until they sailed. When the ship arrived in Normandy, she landed on Omaha Beach and worked with the medics to get the wounded back to the hospital ship and interviewed the men for her news reports. The only other women who got close to the battle on the 6th of June were those manning the switchboards at SHAEF headquarters in Portsmouth. They would send and receive information and orders from the commanders in the UK to the commanders on the French beaches. When they received the messages, the switchboard operator could hear the sounds of battle in the background. I can imagine that was quite an experience that they would never forget. Now, the first British woman, a nursing orderly, arrived on D+7 in the first of the Kazovac flights. Her aircraft landed on one of the temporary airfields that had been built by the British and American engineers who had landed on the beaches on the 6th of June. These airfields were used to deliver supplies to the front and be used by the squadrons, providing air support during the battle. Each supply aircraft would then bring casualties back, and they were looked after by the nursing orderly on board the aircraft. The success of this first operation opened the way for many more flights for the air evacuation of the wounded, and she and her fellow nurses became known as the Flying Nightingales. Florence Nightingale Museum in London has an exhibition about them. They've also got a free talk on the 15th of June if you want to find out more. By the end of the 11th of June, 1944, over 300,000 troops, over 54,000 vehicles, and over 104,000 tons of supplies had been landed on the beaches, an incredible achievement. And I'll hand you back to Vicky.
Great, thanks, that's brilliant. And Claire, I'm going to ask you now to tell us what the role of the French resistance was on D-Day, and also what it was like for civilians actually living in Normandy, having this invasion coming towards them.
Yes, thank you very much. I would like to show you these photographs taken on the 14th of June, when de Gaulle managed to do a round trip to Normandy. He didn't stay there, he came back to England immediately afterwards. But you see this little town of Bayeux, which had been liberated as soon as the 7th of June. So this town didn't suffer much from bombings. And you see the crowd, the children, the joy of the people. And this was a sort of consecration for de Gaulle, who had been named the president of the provisional government of the French Republic since the 3rd of June 1944. Before that, he was the leader of the resistance, but from June 1944, he was the president of a hopefully regular government to be installed in France. This joy here, you see people, is unmitigated because the casualty of the bombings were almost null in Bayeux. So I would like now to turn to the part of the Normandy who was not immediately liberated. And I show you a map. where I'll explain, I'll give some cases. You know that the Allies had planned to liberate Normandy within 3 weeks. And in fact, it took them more than 6 weeks, during which civilians in Normandy and resistance were exposed to many dangers. I'll begin with the American part of the liberation, if I may say, around the town of Perrier. You see this little town of 2,000 people west of Saint-Lô, which endured very severe bombings on the 8th and the 13th of June. It endured bombings during several weeks until late July 1944. But on those 2 nights, Perrier, which was a 2,000 people town, lost 127 people under the bombs. And why Perrier and other little towns in Normandy? Because they were at the crossroads of different roads, which could help the Germans to repel the Allies to the sea. In Perrier, we have the logbook of a headmistress of a boarding school for girls from 11 to 15. And the headmistress tells us how she managed to keep alive her girls, first of all in the cellar. And it was really frightening. The noise itself is a cause of panic, the noise of bombing, plus the shuddering of the earth, plus the noise of the buildings crumbling all around. But she managed to calm the girls, and after several days, they fled the town, and they lived in the woods or in barns. And as you know, this summer was not a nice one. There were much rain, so it wasn't comfortable. It wasn't a happy life, but it was not either so terrible because they had something to eat. You know, this is Normandy, where there are many cows. Farmers had fled also, so many cows were roaming the fields, and the girls could milk the cows. And also they had the preserves, the canned food of the boarding school with them. So they lived not only under the bombs, but also under the shells, because they were in the middle of the battlefield between Americans and Germans. It was really dangerous, but in fact they kept hope, and they were so much waiting for the Allies. They didn't know it was the Americans. It was only the Allies in their language. When the Allies arrived, among the ruins and among many people having lost siblings, it was an enormous joy. The Americans are coming, the Americans are here, and this is a cry that covered all France, as well as the English are arriving. But among the girls, some of them had not seen their parents, and they wondered, why didn't my parents come and pick me up? And some of them became very anxious. At last, there was only one girl who had not been picked up by her parents, and she was weeping all day long, convinced that her family has been destroyed under the bombs. But the headmistress took them not by car, because there were no more car in occupied France, but by a horse-driven cart. The headmistress took her to the farm of her parents, and she was so afraid, this girl, she was already 15, she was so afraid that she begged her headmistress to do a U-turn and to go away from the farm. In fact, they reached the farm, and there was all her family very much alive. So it's a happy end. I would like to speak now of the British part of the liberation of Normandy. and to show the action of the resistance. On the 7th of June, several paratroopers fell behind the lines. They fell not near the beach, but among occupied France, in occupied France. And you see this little town of Giberville, which is very near Caen, where 3 paratroopers found a shelter among helpers. 10 helpers of this town managed to hide them, to heal them, because 2 of them were wounded, and to give them civilian clothes. And they tried to join their own comrades by going through the lines, but it was too difficult. So they went south with the help of helpers who guided them, and eventually they were liberated by the Americans in southwestern France. And after having themselves helped the resistance in return in the Maquis. This is another happy end. But the other side of the story is not so happy, because on the 14th of July, the Gestapo carried out a large roundup, and it took a part of the helpers and other resistors, tortured them in the town of Argence near Caen, and they shot them in the back of the neck. And then they throw their bodies in mass graves in Saint-Pierre-du-Jonquet. This was secret interment, and after the war, the French had a hard time finding back the bodies. The last ones were found in 1946, and still 11 of the 30 bodies found there are still not identified. But through these various efforts, eventually, with the Allies and the resistance and simply humane people, Normandy managed to be liberated.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Claire. Really interesting to hear those stories and hear about the bravery of the French resistance fighters. So now I'm going to go back to David and perhaps ask you, David, quite briefly, because we're really running out of time and I want to leave time for questions, to tell us a bit about sending secret messages to the resistance in advance of D-Day. So if you could do that quite briefly, then we're going to show a little film of a veteran.
Okay. Thanks, Vicky. Yeah. So the BBC, I'm sure you all know and watch a lot of the BBC and listen to BBC radio. BBC during before the Normandy campaign and on D-Day itself were broadcasting messages, hidden messages within radio broadcasts, and they were called le message personnel. And this was to trigger the French resistance and an organisation called a Special Operations Executive to carry out sabotage, to try and disrupt the German military who were coming to reinforce the Normandy defences. It was a very well choreographed, well planned operation, but the BBC were very important in this respect.
So those messages allowed the French resistance to know that the invasion was about to start. Brilliant. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is ask one of my colleagues we have a short film of one of the Normandy D-Day veterans. Unfortunately, he couldn't be with us because he is in Normandy today at the Normandy Memorial commemorations. So we'll show you this brief film. He joined up when he was 17 years old, and so he was very young when he went into Normandy. While the film is showing, I'd like you to think if you have any questions for our 3 speakers and to put them into the chat. And after the film, we will come to questions. So Rachel, if you're ready to show the film.
I'm Ken Hay. I was in the 4th Battalion Dorset Regiment. and we landed at Corso on the 23rd of June, following up the Canadians, and we went inland from there. We went out on night patrol on the 7th of July. We thought we were blowing up something in no man's land, but in fact the information was wrong. It was behind their lines. They let us through, but then sealed it off. So we had a battle. My brother was a corporal in the same platoon. 30 people went out. 16, I understand, got back. 5 of us got captured, so we presume 9 were killed. So I went off to Poland eventually, being transported in the wagons, horrible, and went coal mining near Katowice in southern Poland until the 22nd of January. On the 23rd, they told we were moving to another camp when the Russians were advancing. But in fact, we just set out in ice and snow, and we marched for 3 months until the 20th of April, when we heard gunfire coming from the west, and we knew it was either the Brits or the Americans. Turned out to be Americans. Anyway, they released us on the 22nd of April. It was a long walk, 1,000 miles. I was very impressed. It's got an atmosphere, hasn't it? But I was all right until I found a colleague, and that threw me up. Teddy Shaker's just somewhere. He's on one of the pillars that we found, and he was a chap I served with. It's quite strange. I can stand at his grave and say a prayer, but when you see his name, that was it. But I think they've done a marvellous job, recognition of their sacrifice, what they've given. I was 18, and there were some other youngsters, look, 21, and so on. No life. I'm just coming up to 97. I didn't serve for very long, and in that sense, I feel a bit of a fraud when you say this, you know. But that's the way the cookie crumbles, as they say.
Great, and that's Ken Hay, who's a veteran of D-Day, and you could see there at the end of the film the Normandy Memorial, which is the memorial that Jane was speaking about at the beginning, the memorial to all of the British soldiers who were part of the invasion of Normandy. And we have a longer interview with Ken, which I'm going to ask one of my colleagues to put the link up to that. So if you're interested to hearing more from Ken and his experiences, we do have a longer interview of that. So we do have a couple of questions which I'm going to ask the panel. And in the meantime, please add any further questions that you have, anyone in the audience. We've got about 10 minutes left for questions. Somebody's asking about what was the role of Portsmouth in D-Day? Jane, I don't know, or David, if you would be able to answer that. Jane, to start, maybe. You're on mute, Jane.
Yeah, Portsmouth was one of the many embarkation points for the servicemen who were coming across to France. So there are a series of them along the south coast, but Portsmouth was almost the biggest one. That's where SHAEF was based. So that was kind of like the hub of the information. But this is where many of the soldiers would embark onto their boats. The boats, and this was all on the night of the 5th of June. Some were setting off sort of the day before, because some ships were very, very slow. So in order for them to be able to get across the channel in time for the landing times, they needed to leave a bit earlier. But they would then embark. They would meet at a point just off this Isle of Wight, and then head across to France in one massive convoy. I mean, I can imagine that it was a sight if you ever saw it, and certainly, you know, pilots who were flying over the channel at the time commented on how amazing it looked.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I don't know if either of you have anything to add to that about Portsmouth.
I could just add in, Vicky, on the hill that overlooks Portsmouth, there's a fort called Fort Southwick. There was a very important Royal Navy communications centre there. That was, I mean, the main part of D-Day was an amphibious and a naval operation which was called Neptune. So 7,000 ships. It was the biggest armada the world has ever seen. So it involved a huge amount of logistics and planning. And this Fort Southwick was important for that. And there was hundreds of staff, and it was all underground in a bunker, a series of bunkers underneath this fort, which you can still go and see. I think it's a laser tag centre now, just on the hill above Portsmouth.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. And the next question is, how long did the invasion last altogether? Maybe I can ask you, Claire, this about the liberation of France.
Yes. You know, in French, we don't use the word invasion.
No.
Because it has another resonance in French. Invasion in French history, it's invasion by the Germans in 1817, 1914, 1940. So we say, in fact, very simply, the landing of Normandy, landing of Provence. And the liberation of France, in fact, lasted almost a year, because there were, at the end, there were still pockets of Germans on the coast, on the Atlantic coast, which were not liberated until the 8th of May in Saint-Nazaire and in the south, I forgot, some Royan. And these pockets were liberated by the Allies, by bombings, with the help of the resistance of the underground. But the most part of France had already been liberated. Alsace was liberated in November 1944, and this was almost the end of the liberation of the territory, except for the pockets. The liberation of the southeast of France went very quickly. Contrary to the Normandy front, the Provence front was relatively easy. The Allies had planned a liberation of this part of France in a month, and in fact it took a fortnight to reach Lyons. So it was much easier because most of the Germans were busy with the Normandy front.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. And David, can you tell us a little bit more? I didn't give you very much time about the role of SOE and transmission of secret messages to between the resistance and Bletchley Park.
Yeah, Special Operations Executive, SOE, was a covert unit that was set up really after the occupation of France, and after Dunkirk. You might have heard of the extraction of the British Army from Dunkirk, and Churchill wanted to take the fight back to Germany, and SOE were very involved in the Normandy campaign. There were hundreds and hundreds of operatives who'd been specially trained to work with the French resistance to carry out sabotage, certainly against the railway networks, to stop German tanks and ammunition, etc., coming up through the railway network in France. And they worked very, very closely with the French resistance, but it was very, very dangerous. Many of those SOE operatives were captured and they were executed. It was a very dangerous existence for them, but you know, they made a huge contribution to intelligence as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Jane, there's a question for you come in from Canterbury Academy. They would like to know how the survivors of the D-Day landings are commemorated. Do they have names at the memorial, or is it just the names of the people who died?
No, it is just the names of the fallen who are named on our memorial. But what we do have on our website are what we call veteran stories. So where we have veteran stories, either from the likes of Ken Hay with the video that he's done. We have a number of other videos on our website where the veterans talk about their experience and what happened to them. And also families have sent in us some stories about their relative who had served and, you know, was able to, who survived the war. So there are a few of those on our website which you can read and find out what they did.
Great. I'll ask one of my colleagues to post that in the Normandy Memorial Trust website, to post that in the chat so people can have a look. Another question is, was there any disagreement between the Allies about the tactics that should be used in the build-up to D-Day?
You want to answer that one? There's always disagreement with Allied commanders, but there was a sequence of conferences that in the lead up to Operation Overlord, where certainly, you know, people like Stalin, Churchill, Eisenhower, the main leaders and commanders of the Allied offensive were in agreement that we needed to go into northern France to establish a second front. So there was another front which was called the Eastern Front, which the Russians were fighting the Germans on, and over many years, and it was a war of attrition. There were millions of people died during that Eastern Front campaign, and the Russians really, there's a term that's used, they paid the butcher's bill for the Second World War, but it was we needed to establish a second front, and there was certainly Allied agreement to do so.
Yeah. Claire.
Yes, there was a minor, a very micro disagreement, but which was major for France. It was the fact that the Allies didn't inform General de Gaulle about the date of the landing, and he was informed only 2 days before. He was very angry with that, and it is probably one of the reasons why he didn't organize big commemoration of the landings of Normandy when he was president of the Republic. He always went to the commemoration in Provence, but not in Normandy. He was very angry because also at that time the Allies had not recognized him as the president of the French government. So there was several disagreement between French and Allies.
Brilliant. Well, we've come to the end of our time this morning, so I'd like to say thank you so much to our 3 speakers for their really interesting stories and comments around what happened during the D-Day landings. Thank you all for watching. There will be the video of this event will be made available to you, and you can also, as we've posted in the chat, there's a longer interview with Ken Hay that you're also really should look at to hear more of his story. So thank you all so much, and please watch out for the news coverage later on today from Normandy, where you can see the veterans who will be gathering at the Normandy Memorial, which you saw in that little video. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a lovely day.